Hi, I'm Steve Boyles, a Ohio State Beef Extension Specialist, and this short video is about cattle disposition and impact it has on carcass value. Disposition can be defined as how wild or how tame cattle can be. Typically, cattle that are wilder will have a wider flight zone. Why do they act differently? Well, it could be partially due to genetics. The heritability of disposition is 0.4 to 0.6 on a 0 to 1 scale. Also environment, i.e. corral design. A well-designed corral can reduce stress and reduce behavioral responses to any sort of stress. Also, the handler of these animals can have a big impact on the disposition and behavior of these cattle. Admittedly, cattle that are easily excitable are a danger to themselves and their herd mates, but also certainly to the stock persons that are working with these animals. There was a study done a few years ago at Iowa State University that looked at feedlot performance and carcass values with regards to disposition. The data is based on over 13,000 head of beef cattle in 8 different feed yards, and they assigned a disposition score at the squeeze chute. First when the cattle went on feed, then midway through the feeding period, and then prior to going to the packing plant. The Beef Improvement Federation disposition scoring sheet was used for this project. It goes from 1 to 6, 1 being very docile to 6 being very aggressive animals. Overall, there was a small number, but nevertheless 758 animals were considered somewhat aggressive as compared to other animals in the study. Arrival weight, cattle that were tamer arrived at a heavier weight than did cattle that were relatively wild. Through the entire feeding period, cattle that were tame had a higher average daily gain than did animals that were somewhat wild or aggressive. Overall feed efficiency was superior for the tame animals as compared to the wild animals. Therefore, it took more pounds of feed to get a pound of gain in these animals that were somewhat more wild. Do tame cattle get sick more? Looking at this data, cattle that are 1s and 2s, relatively docile, had a little bit higher morbidity or sickness rate than the aggressive, although the cattle that were aggressive had a higher mortality rate. What's going on here? Well, possibility is, how do we spot sick cattle? One of the things is looking for depression, the head lowered, ears drooping, dull eyes, and they don't have a great desire to move. When checking pens, wild cattle are more likely to be at the back of the pen, head held high, and ears up and eyes watching every move you make. Looking at the different things we might look at: depression, appetite, respiratory index, and temperature. Depression, we just talked about, and how disposition can affect that. Appetite. Poor disposition cattle tend to stay away from the feed bunk until feed wagon or truck is out of sight. Therefore, 2 of maybe one of our key factors that we look for sickness are affected by disposition. If we think about it, in nature, one of the ways to survive is don't look sick. Now, those wild animals or cattle that are at the back of the pen with their heads up, their ears looking at us, they may look healthy, but they may apparently are hiding how bad they feel. So that could be one of the reasons we saw a lower morbidity rate for wild animals. Don't look sick. The impact of disposition on carcass quality grade. When we talk about quality grade, we're talking about marbling, intramuscular marbling. So we have more marbling here. This is cattle that are prime and choice. And then less marbling here, something in the select range. Well, looking at this, the yellow bar is USDA choice. Notice that there is a lower percentage of cattle that are wild that grade choice. Similarly, down here, maybe harder to notice, there's fewer prime cattle as well, with cattle that are somewhat more wild. Correspondingly, there is an increased number of select and increased number of standard cattle in those animals that are wild or somewhat aggressive. Overall net return, dollar numbers can vary from year to year, but overall the trend was there was more money to be made with cattle that are relatively docile as compared to cattle that are wild or relatively aggressive. In summary of this study, cattle that were wild had a lower average daily gain, less favorable feed efficiency, lower quality grades of the choice and prime levels, and lower net returns. Looking at dark cutters, different factors can affect cattle that are dark cutters. Typically the customer wants bright cherry red. Probably one of the worst times to ship cattle is it's cold, rainy, sleet, high winds. That can increase the incidence of dark cutters at the packing plant. Also, mixing unfamiliar cattle together. They're going to be fighting initially, and that's going to expend energy, and that can lead to increased incidences of dark cutters. This is a study out of France looking at this issue, and they also looked at tenderness. They took samples and did Warner-Batchelor shear tests. They found cattle, and they had a 1 to 4 scale, cattle that were wild had a relatively higher level of toughness to the meat, and also a higher number of animals that would be considered dark cutters.